Caroline Aston is a royal commentator as well. Delighted to have you both with us. Caroline, maybe I'll start with you actually, because it has been a big year, a huge year constitutionally. And we're in a situation where King Charles is, well, I think he's found his feet. But what are your memories of the Queen, and how do you view things kind of a year on? Because maybe we actually view her in a slightly different way now than we did in the immediate aftermath of the Queen's death.
I would totally agree with you there. I still think some people feel disorientated that that figure who was part of our lives for 70 plus years is no longer there. And I know in the immediate aftermath of her passing, I find it very difficult to call him King Charles III. The odd Prince of Wales slipped out to begin with.
It's when people say Prince of Wales and they're talking about Prince William, I sort of have to do a little... The King Charles thing I can just about get. Also, for people who are barristers, senior barristers who are KCs rather than QCs. I got stamps the other day and they had Charles on them. There's so many different things, aren't there?
You're right. I should have said Prince Charles. I forgot to upgrade his rank to begin with. But of course, I think all of us would say that she left us so suddenly. That last photograph when she received Liz Truss, her last Prime Minister that she was to receive, frail, depleted, and you're showing now this wonderful picture of her as a beautiful brunette princess in 1947 when she made her speech to the nation, pledging her whole life, however long or short it might be, to duty and service. And my goodness me, she certainly did that. And then in the aftermath of her death, of course, her son spoke to the nation, if you remember, with his personal grief and the grief of the country, of course, on his own face, saying, "May flights of angels sing thee to thy rest." And of course, they most certainly did. The choreography, the pomp, the pageantry, the final journey from Balmoral, her beloved Scottish estate, bringing her through Scotland down to Westminster Hall, those long queues that snaked back as people came from really all over the world to pay a last respect to her. And even, of course, the stories of squabbles in the queue, of celebrity queue jumping, all of that. And then, of course, coming into the new royal year, The Sword of Damocles, the book by Harry, the tale of broken dog bowls, necklaces and broken hearts was published. And the king, of course, had to go on preparing for his coronation, which was a very different coronation, of course, to the one of his mother. Less diamonds, less elaborate robes, less peers of the realm, a pared down modern coronation, embracing the multi-ethnicity and culture of our country today, which has changed immeasurably since Her Majesty's accession in 1952. And since then, of course, he's been out there, hasn't he, showing himself to the people, because, of course, as his mother said, royalty has to be seen to be believed.
Oh, that's absolutely true. It's interesting, actually. Caroline has been looking back. We've been looking back. I've been thinking about it. But actually, the King as well released an audio statement of his views a year on from his mother's death. We played this quite a lot on Friday, but let's just remind ourselves what King Charles III said about his mother's death a year on.
In marking the first anniversary of Her late Majesty's death and my accession, we recall with great affection her long life, devoted service, and all she meant to so many of us. I am deeply grateful, too, for the love and support that has been shown to my wife and myself during this year, as we do our utmost to be of service to you all.
It's fascinating that quite reasonably, I suppose, King Charles mentioned Queen Camilla there as well. And Caroline, I wonder what you make of the fact that she was the great villain, wasn't she, for such a long time? And of course, it's 22 years this week as well since, or just last weekend, since the tragic death of Princess Diana in Paris. And really, Camilla was seen as such a villain for such a long time, but now she is Queen of our country, the Queen Consort, and she is someone who a lot of people feel a lot of affection for and have time for. And is that a PR masterstroke, or is that just that we've got to know her, do you think?
Combination of both. You have to know people, you have to become familiar with them, and, you know, the Queens were big shoes to fill for both our new king and his wife. And you're right, there will still be many people listening to this, watching this, who have very, how shall we say, mixed feelings about what went on in the the marriage of Charles and Diana, the breakdown of that, the sudden tragic death of Diana.
I should say, sorry to interrupt you, Caroline, I should say it was 26 years ago rather than 22. I got my mathematics wrong. Do continue, Caroline.
Too much of a lady to correct you, but thank you for correcting yourself. Quite right so. You know, this tragic death, the sudden death of Diana, and of course the family problems that brought about. We see Prince Harry today still talking of the immense impact on his mental health. And of course, the discord going on in the royal family at the moment at a very human and personal level. Camilla, I think, has worked hard. She espouses causes that we recognise, and she comes across, doesn't she, as someone who's willing to roll her sleeves up, get out there, mix and mingle. We like that, but that isn't to say, of course, that there won't be people, as I mentioned a moment ago, who have big reservations, and it will take perhaps some time for that to work through. PR-wise, I think they're playing a blinder here. It seems to be going really, really well. And let's face it, neither of these two leaders of our nation, if you like, are young people. I don't know what you thought, but I thought that moment in the coronation when the king kneels before he's anointed, before he's screened, and we saw him from the back, he looked an elderly man.
Yes,
He's 75 on November the 14th. And I think, really, the maths of the succession here are against a long reign. We might just get a silver jubilee, but you can cross off gold, diamond and platinum here. And his big, big piece of work here is relevancy of the royal family going forward, which is very much vested in Kate, William, and those amazingly photogenic children of his that, you know, are gradually being introduced into the royal way of life.
Louis seems to have a lovely personality, doesn't he? He's a bit of a live wire.
I love it. He can always be relied upon to put his hands over his ears, scratch his nose, or do something that every camera zooms in on. And of course, you have to have good optics. That's another difference between now and when the Queen came onto the throne. Back then, she was a white hand waving, a floral hat, an age of curtsies and corsets and so on. Now, the internet, social media has made the royal family perpetually visible at all times. When they're good, they're very, very good, but when they're horrid, well, we all know very quickly.
Well, indeed. And just talking about Louis and boyish charm, James Heale is also with us from The Spectator, and we have, I mean, it was a fascinating final engagement for the Queen, and indeed the first engagement as Prime Minister, the kissing of hands with Liz Truss. And Liz Truss gave an interview this week where she said, you know, the Queen was with it. She knew what was going on. She was fully across the detail of that meeting, and or that meeting where the kissing of hands, where Liz Truss became Prime Minister. And I'm just glad one of those women was.
Well, I think that really it showed the Queen's dedication to duty to the last. Really, you know, from talking to people and from reports I've read, it seems that the Queen's health, you know, in her 96th year, was declining in those last few months, but she was still with it. And I think really was trying to make it through to that kissing of the hand.
Yes.
We knew in early July that Boris Johnson would step down as Prime Minister. We knew a new one was expected in September. And so really her final public duty was to swear in her, I think it's her 14th Prime Minister, her last Prime Minister, and therefore, you know, just get through that whole day. And I think that, you know, the impression that Liz Truss gives is someone who was with it, obviously was in, you know, wasn't in, you know, ideal health, but was getting through it, and then died just 2 days later on the Thursday afternoon.
Yes, indeed. And it's funny, actually, because Dr. David Bull, who's a presenter on the station as well, of course, you'll know James, actually says, you know, he had seen a number of times where there are elderly people who just say, you know, I'm just going to get through Christmas, I'm just going to get to the wedding of my son or daughter or whatever. And he says he's seen it time and time again where people are absolutely determined to go on. And I remember in my own family, actually, my grandmother died, and very soon after, her sister, who was very close to her, died as well. On Liz Truss, actually, you've written a great book, Out of the Blue. I mean, it was just the start of an absolutely disastrous 49 days as Prime Minister. Do you think the seeds were there at the start? Was it ever going to be successful, James?
I think that a lot of the decisions were made before she entered number 10. So even on day one, as she came in, she'd chosen, I think, some of the wrong personnel, backroom staff. She'd chosen a cabinet full of loyalists, which I don't think helped her when the political tidings got rough. Also, the economic situation had worsened. And I think that really the Queen's death did play a role in all of this. I mean, Kwasi Kwarteng was mocked for saying this, but I do think that it shocked the national psyche. It changed the calculations. It meant that the mini budget happened the day after Bank of England rate rise. And I think that basically the country was still reeling from the impact of that, a loss of a much-loved royal figure who for 70 years we hadn't had a period of national mourning. And I think that really was an underplayed part in it. And then obviously we had straight out of that and bang back into politics, and a mini budget was sent the markets spiralling.
Yeah, indeed. And we can actually see that picture now of the Queen and Liz Truss, the Queen's final engagement, James. And it is interesting as well because we had a new king, and Liz Truss, of course, had to deal with that, saying goodbye to the Queen. That took up actually a lot of those 49 days. That was something she had to lead the nation and be very, very quick at. And was that by itself, was that something that took the wind out of her sails, even though it was something that was absolutely right and proper that it had to happen? But from the political perspective, and I don't mean to be disrespectful in any way here, but the political momentum that a new Prime Minister has is suddenly truncated by the death of a much-loved monarch who I mean, I'm sure I can speak for everyone in this country. At least things are different now. Even if you're not a royalist, you can acknowledge that. And for many of us, we miss her.
Completely, and it really changed the feel. And I think that, first of all, remember that Liz Truss was the first person publicly to utter the words "God save the King" outside number 10. She made that announcement. She gave the first speech of the new King's reign. And I think really thereafter, it was, sadly, the next 13 days or so of, of going through, sermons and churches and readings was, if anything, the sort of the best bit of the highlight of her time as Prime Minister, because thereafter that we had the economic package, and it all went wrong from there. What's also really interesting, I think, is that when we talk about the mini budget and what went wrong in that, it wasn't just the mini budget, of course, it was the energy price cap announcement, which she announced on day one, and a lot of awkward questions, I think, that would have been asked about how was that huge package, which was forecast at the time to be the largest ever peacetime market intervention in the economy, how was that going to be funded? And instead the Queen died, and it meant that a lot of awkward questions and difficult debates never happened.
That was the same day, wasn't it? The energy price cap was announced on the Thursday, and then it was all this very worrying rumours, is the Queen dead? And then, of course, it was finally confirmed that she was.
Yes, and as you say, Nadhim Zahawi came in with a note in the House of Commons for both benches, basically telling them to hurry up, wind up. And so then thereafter, the Queen deteriorated, and that afternoon, on the Wednesday, she'd had to cancel plans for a virtual Privy Council meeting with the new cabinet. And really then the news was sort of leaking out, and it was basically a matter of time at that point. And, I remember going around Parliament and Westminster that evening, shortly after the news was announced at, 6:10. And just the sense of shock and sadness. I saw MPs crying. I saw people just, outside the pub, just lost for words, black ties out. It was a really real sense, a profound moment in the national psyche.
It's interesting, actually, because now King Charles is, of course, King Charles III. He was something of a political figure in some ways, actually. He certainly made his views known on very controversial political issues like the environment, like some things like architecture as well. And Caroline, I wonder if I could perhaps bring you in again and say that he is now, do you think he's sort of taken a step back from those more controversial views? He knows he now needs to follow his mother's example in being more of a national figure, and someone who is apolitical, or as apolitical as you can be as monarch.
Well, of course, don't forget, as Prince of Wales, he was able to write to people. Sometimes he wrote too much, sometimes he said too much, but he's well aware that his new position means he is a constitutional monarch. And in fact, he actually publicly stated that, and I quote, "I'm not a fool." He had been doing a 70-year apprenticeship, if you think about it.
That's right.
With one of the probably greatest constitutional monarchs we've ever had. So
most people get a job and then retire, whereas with Prince Charles, he did it in the opposite way before he became king.
Well, he's a record breaker. He's the oldest king we've ever crowned, and certainly the Prince of Wales who waited the longest ever for the top job. So if he doesn't know what the essence of constitutional monarchy is, well, who would?
Yeah.
But I suspect, privately, he will fume sometimes and wish that perhaps his royal feathers hadn't been quite so well clipped by his accession to the throne.
James, just a final word from you on Liz Truss. What is she up to now? She's a former Prime Minister, of course. She'll have police protection for the rest of her life, but just having had 49 days as Prime Minister, I hear there's a book coming out soon, is that right? She's giving speeches. I mean, it's quite weird to be a former Prime Minister anyway. I know Theresa May has a book out this week as well, actually, but in terms of someone who's been a Prime Minister for such a short time, what do you kind of now do? And she's not an old woman at all.
Quite, and we now have more ex-prime ministers, I think, living than we've ever had before. So what does one do for them all? And they each have chosen their own different paths. Theresa May has chosen to be quite a quiet, distinguished backbencher, making rare interventions in the Commons, and she seems to have carved that niche for herself. David Cameron tried to be a bit of a businessman, didn't work out too well for him with Greensill. And now Liz Truss is someone who has always enjoyed policy, always enjoyed the battle of ideas. She intends to stay in the House of Commons too, but is certainly never shy about intervening as and when she seems necessary. She's got this book coming out, which, although it's going to touch on things like, personal anecdotes, such as that last meeting with the Queen, it's also going to be forward-looking to the future. And her real concern is about the wider Western world, the threat from China, and economic systems which underpin it. So that's going to be her main focus. And I imagine that would involve a lot of travel between here and Washington and the States as well.
Thank you both very, very much indeed. That's Caroline Aston, the royal commentator, and James Heale, who is the biographer of Liz Truss, Out of the Blue. It's a great book. I've read it, and maybe a year on from Liz Truss is the time to read it as well. Probably the second best book written about politics in the last 5 years.